Hello there, eighth grade. Welcome back. Yeah, don't try and wipe that little dot off my forehead. Yep, it's there. I had a run in with a hydrangea bush, but it's okay. I won. All right, missed you guys. Anybody do anything fun for spring break? I went to Lake Samish State Park, had lunch with my wife, and also went out, looked at the tulips, and went up to Wenatchee River and blew it past one day. Still doing the social distancing thing, but checking stuff out, getting out of the house. All right. So today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. Not great because it was a good thing, and the years leading up because we'd kind of finished World War One and sort of the aftermath of that. So this picture right here is of a woman named Florence Thompson, and she's sort of an iconic photo of the Great Depression. But we'll get into that in a minute. We'll get ahead of ourselves here. All right, so just kind of showing you here this contrast. So you can see up above some pictures of the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. Got their outfits and partying, and yes, everyone's smoking. It was a time when a lot of people smoked. And then over here on the left, you can see some pictures of the Great Depression and sort of what happened afterwards. And you don't have to know what gross domestic product is, other than essentially a measure of a country's wealth. And you can see the United States. Went up until 1929, and then you see that huge dip there, and that's what we're looking at with the Great Depression. So again, the Roaring 20s, a lot of stuff going on. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. If you don't know what that is by now, then you should look it up. Industries grow, produce affordable luxury items like, for example, this Model T Ford. It had dropped almost 300% in price over the 20s. It could be bought for under $300, which granted was a lot of money back then, but again, huge drop off in what it costs. Electricity was starting to show up in people's homes. These luxury items, such as electrical appliances, radios, for example, now are available to everyday citizens. And the stock market surges. It doubles its highest ever value from 1919 through the 20s. And again, part of this is because it's not just rich people investing in the stock market anymore. There's a lot of middle class investment in the stock market. In 1920s society, so flappers, that's if you look in this upper right picture here, known for doing things like wearing shorter dresses and cutting their hair short. And seems, not a big deal today, but for then, kind of challenging the societal norms that existed at the time. And then we also have the Harlem Renaissance, which is it's called that because it takes place primarily in Harlem, mostly African American community. And so a lot of writing that comes out of there, jazz, a picture of Louis Armstrong there. And then this is a young Langston Hughes in this other picture. And this is an excerpt of a poem of his, one of his first ones actually, and one of his more famous one, Negro Speaks of Rivers. And so here it starts out, I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. It's kind of the middle section of the poem. If you ever have a chance to read any Langston Hughes poetry, but also just read that poem in its entirety. Very good poet. All right, so Black Tuesday, as it's referred to, and the collapse being of the stock market. So the stock market had been overvalued. A lot of people were investing in it, and prices kept going up and up and up, and people kept investing. And then, and then, like I say there in the next bullet, there's more investors than ever in the stock market. So not only is it the most it's ever been valued at, but it has the most investors involved. So the prices become so overinflated that people start to sell off their stock. One, because they're afraid the prices are going to drop anyway, and two, they can't imagine it getting any higher. So many people sell their stock that there's a panic on the stock market. And so these stocks, these pieces of the company is essentially what they are, lose so much value that the companies in turn lose value, and they lose a lot of their access to money and a lot of their overall value. And so they start to lay off workers. And then not too long after this, there's a bank run. So people start to go to the banks. They want to get their money out. They need their money. And what happens is the banks, when you put your money in the bank today, the bank doesn't just put it in a vault somewhere and it sits there. They make money off your money. And they do that by investing primarily in bonds, but a little bit in the stock market, and then by making loans to other people. And so the problem is that the bank never has all the money that it owes to people sitting in the bank at one time. So if everybody shows up at the bank and wants to take their money out, there's a problem. And we'll talk about one of the ways that the government tried to solve this afterwards. And then to add insult to injury, Dust Bowl hits the Midwest. So there's a huge collapse throughout the Midwest on farms, and just adds to the overall economic collapse of the country. So a couple things that come out of this are hobos and Hoovervilles. So Hoovervilles are essentially shanty towns and cities. You have 2 million of 130 million U.S. citizens are homeless. So they build these, houses, for lack of a better term, more like shacks, out of whatever material they can find. That very top right picture, I don't know if you recognize that building in the background, but that's the Smith Tower. And so that's actually a picture from Seattle. I believe the other one's from New York. And then hobos, and I think today people don't exactly understand what they were doing, but in the Great Depression, they were riding trains to find temporary jobs across the U.S. So if they didn't have work at home, they would hop on a freight train. And part of the reason they did that is because they didn't have money to buy a ticket. So they'd ride this freight train and they'd come to a place like a farm or a cannery, maybe a stockyard, wherever, and they'd get off the train and they'd work. And it was seasonal work. Maybe they'd work a few weeks, maybe a few months. And then when the job ended, they'd hop back on the train and go somewhere else. And so part of this is because the unemployment had reached 25% in the United States, which it's never been that high ever. So these are kind of two things that start to happen early on in the Great Depression, just to kind of show you how bad things are and how much the U.S. economy had been hurt. So FDR is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He gets elected president in 1932. And this quote here, or this bullet says that he follows John Maynard Keynes' school. And simply all that means is that Keynes was a proponent of when the economy starts to falter, the government steps in. And that doesn't necessarily mean regulation as much as it means what they call deficit spending, so that nobody has any money to include the government, but the government will issue bonds that are basically saying, look, we'll pay these back later. And it generates cash now so that the government can help out with the economy. And so they do that in a couple ways. One of them is the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's the TVA there. They build dams throughout the Tennessee River area, so the southeast, helps stop flooding, helps create power through hydroelectric dams. And there's some other ones there, WPA, CCC. Actually, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, is one near and dear to my heart. They did a lot of work in national parks. So a lot of roads that you see built on federal land. And they did a lot of other things too, but generally with the environment, soil conservation, stuff like that. But most importantly, it created jobs for people. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, there was always a U.S. Army officer that was in charge of a group, and that group would go and work for the government somewhere, again, building a road or whatever it may be, or as you can see in this picture, putting up telephone poles. And then the government would pay them. So now they had a job, and they were required to send, I think it was something like 2/3 or 3/4 of that paycheck back home to their families. Because these were all men living in, for lack of a better term, tent cities or barracks if they had them, if they had some little wood huts. Some of the things the government did, the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, basically make sure that the stock market doesn't get out of control like it did in the 20s. The FDIC, it's a federally, I should know this, but it's deposit insurance something. But basically what it does is it makes sure that the bank, is insured, so that if everybody shows up again and to do that bank run, everybody wants their money out at the same time, the government will back the bank up. It will make sure everyone gets their money. And then the bank can pay back the government later. And then Social Security. So Social Security didn't exist before then, now it does. And essentially you pay into a nationwide fund, and then when you retire, you get money back from the government. Just to make sure that if you're, older, retired, if you're somehow handicapped in some way, like you lose an arm during work or something, or if your parents die. They also issue checks to orphans. So then a couple other things happened. The Dawes Act is repealed. So if you remember from last year, that was the act that was put in place to take land away from a lot of Native Americans. So that was repealed, and the Labor Relations Act was put in place, which ended kind of government pursuit of unions. It allowed unions to form under government auspices. All right, so the Great Depression overseas. So it hits the U.S. hard, hits Germany even harder. They're cut off from loans because nobody's giving loans to anyone at this point, in industrial markets. Their number one export partner that they sent all their industrial items to was the United States. So the United States obviously is not buying anything anymore. Unemployment takes off in Germany, even worse there. Over a third of the workforce is unemployed. These pictures over here from Germany, you see, these are stacks of money. So one kid's using them as building blocks, kind of as a toy to play with. Another person there is actually feeding them into the fire for heat, because the money had become so worthless at that point. And then the Japanese government, they actually intervened early with this sort of John Maynard Keynes idea of deficit spending, but they'd lost access to natural resources. Trade had dried up, and Japan doesn't have a lot of its own natural resources. So a picture you see in that lower right corner is actually the Japanese invading Manchuria. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself because we're going to talk about the roots of World War II next time. But what I want you to do right now down in the comments is I want you to go ahead and tell me, I want you to tell me which one of what they're called is the alphabet agencies. So going back, any of these sort of TVA, WPA, CCC. So any of those, actually any, not just agencies, but any sort of idea on this page that interests you. I want you to tell me what it is. I want you to tell me why it interests you. So you're probably gonna have to do a little bit of research on the internet, and I don't want any duplicates. So you could certainly both pick the Civilian Conservation Corps, but your reasons should be different why it interests you. So if I see any duplicates, you will not get credit. All right, good to be back, and good to see you all, and I will talk to you all on Wednesday to redo your quizzes. All right, thanks.